Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Trusted Trustee podcast. And as usual, I'm joined by Tracey Besters for this session. Hello, Tracey. How are you?
Hi, Darin. I'm so very well. Thank you very much. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. Enjoying some of this warmer weather. Hopefully,
Yeah.
summer's coming along with it on a consistent basis. And as usual, the podcast is brought to you by Super Fund Property Valuations, ATO compliance in a click. If your SMSF accountant or auditor is on your back for a property valuation, just order an affordable report from the experts with ease using the details you can see on your screen right now. And I know I always follow the message with how important valuations are. It's actually a pretty good segue because we're changing direction a little bit with this episode. We've been consistent in covering how to get money out of super in the first sort of block of podcasts that we've done. So we're changing directions. It's still an extremely relevant topic because it's an asset class that we know that SMSF trustees and members absolutely love. And in some cases, it's probably why they set up an SMSF in the first place. And that's to do with property inside super. So we're going to have a bit of a chat about that. And of course, later on down the track, we will no doubt talk about valuations, which our most valued sponsor is a part of. And again, I know the ATO cracking down on that, so please make sure you get your valuations right. So I believe we're going to start with some stats today. Is that right, Stace?
Yeah, absolutely.
Your name's Tracey. What's wrong with my brain's fading? It's getting late in the year. I'm sorry, Tracey. Tracey, we're going to start with some property stats today.
That's fine, Darin. Yeah, I thought that we might talk a little bit about the September quarter ATO stats that were released recently. And I'm accountant at heart, so I love numbers, of course. And so, what better way of looking at numbers than looking at statistics, Darin, So my actuary friends would be very proud of me because I'm looking at statistics. So, and I
Very
think
good.
that tying in the quarterly stats with the ATO and looking at all of the questions that come across the forums on Facebook and other social media platforms, and the questions that people are asking, the property is still such a high priority of people in the SMSF space and people who want to set up SMSFs. I think property is just one of those things that they think, well, if I can't, I've got enough property outside or I can't get property outside, let's have a look at having property inside a super fund. So I guess, the interesting thing, well, I guess the exciting thing, the drumroll thing about the total assets of the self-managed super fund industry, Darin, is that we hit $1 trillion of total
Wow.
assets. So we're just over $1 trillion, 1.024 trillion. And if I was to read it out to you, it's 1,024,419,000,000
Wow.
total asset value. I think I got that right. So not used to saying trillions of dollars of numbers.
No.
So we're just over $1 trillion. And the real property investments are sitting at around about 23%. So we're at about $235 billion of property investment inside the super fund. Now, the asterisk, if we had an asterisk on the screen, there is a little bit of unknown quantity of what's sitting in unlisted trusts. So, the ATO are obviously able to easily track using the data that's reported to them about what the direct property ownership is or the real property ownership is, but they obviously don't know what's sitting inside of some of these, unlisted trusts. That's not actually tracked in the statistics. There's another $135 billion of assets sitting in unlisted trusts. I would hazard a guess that, some of that would be property as well, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Without doubt.
So 23% of our asset value sitting in property. So kind of seems a little bit popular, hey?
Yeah, I think you could say that, and I still think that there's obviously an ongoing trend whereby property direct shares and cash are still the main winners among popular asset classes when we're talking about
Yes.
SMSF members and trustees. Now, a really important thing to recognize, I think, Number one, I know that many of our audience would probably like to compare notes as to
Mm.
what their own asset allocations are compared to the broader industry of
Yeah.
SMSFs. But I think most importantly, and this is where hopefully we're adding a bit of a service, cutting through noise versus actual reality. And that is
Mm.
the split between how much is invested in commercial property and how much is invested in residential property. Because I don't know how many arguments you will hear. It's an easy thing to try and cover and get some headlines. You'll see it in the mainstream media a lot
Yeah.
about how SMSFs are heating up the residential property market, and they're evil things and we shouldn't allow them to do that. But the reality paints a slightly different picture to that. So maybe we should have a look at that just to paint some context around some of
Yeah.
the more misleading headlines that some people might read in the mainstream
Yeah,
media.
absolutely. And I've read all of the same headlines that you mentioned, Darin, about how, SMSFs are the evil creatures that are making property harder for everyone to get into. So if we look at the stats, and I apologize, I'm looking at my other screen here because I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. But the
Come on,
investments that
Tracey.
I should have this memorized up here, right? So the residential property direct ownership, there's $57 billion dollars sitting in resi property, which is about 5%,
Yeah,
5.6%, and $107 billion dollars in non-residential, so commercial property, which would include farmland as well.
yeah,
So that's
yeah.
all sitting in the non-residential. And there's $70 billion dollars in LRBAs, Darin, which I think is the other thing that's been, such a big media focus, is about borrowing in self-managed super funds and what
Yeah.
does that look like. So we're seeing we're just under 7% of total asset value in LRBAs. So we're not looking at 20 or 30% of total asset values in LRBAs. We're
No.
looking at 7%. So it's not that much, I don't think.
No, again, it's not catastrophic, and I know that I touched on this at our Trustee Empowerment Day, but
Mm.
the argy-bargy and the negotiating is still going on with the Division 296 tax, which is the new tax on total super balances above $3 million if you're not used to the jargon. And
Mm.
of course, the Greens in their negotiations, or their ambit claim, I suppose you could call, were asking for not only the threshold to be lowered to $2 million, but their pet project, they wanted LRBAs to be
No
banned as
LRBA.
part
Mhm.
of that negotiation process. Absolutely nothing
Yeah.
to do with the tax, but it is it's something that they can't let go. So any turn of the page, they'll put that on
Mm.
the table and they'll argue that, well, if you want my support, you got to ban LRBAs. But again,
Yeah.
it's good to know what the reality of the situation is with what actual impact LRBAs have versus this complete alarmism about how bad they are, and it's preventing young people from getting their first home and that sort of stuff. So it's just
Yeah.
important to make that distinction.
100%, Darren, you're 100% right. And I think that when we look at the total amount of LRBAs across the board with property, we're just sitting on just on 30% of the property assets are LRBAs. So about a third of those property, or the value of those properties, is sitting in borrowings, which to me is not unusual. That's not untoward when you think about deposits on properties and what loan to value ratios would be sitting at. That doesn't seem too over the top to me from a risk category of the overall industry.
Yeah, it's certainly not a figure that I would be thinking that the world's about to cave in because of it.
No.
But I know people out there who will be running around thinking, doing the Chicken Little thing about
Yeah.
the sky's about to fall down because of that statistic. But it is, reality paints a completely different picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why numbers are really important, aren't they? Because we can actually see what the real situation is. So, we're seeing, I think, nothing's really changed. If you actually compare back quarter after quarter after quarter and you go back, we're not seeing massive variations in these numbers. So as the total asset pool grows, we're seeing, about that 20, I think, looking at the numbers quickly, it was somewhere between kind of 21% up to 25% is being the variable of where the direct property has gone in overall asset value. So that's not a huge change. That's not anything that is untoward or quite, significant in my mind. So I guess the interesting part about the non-commercial, the commercial property, the non-residential property, Darin, is what the impact will be on the Div 296. If some of those, some of that non-commercial property has to be sold out of the SMSF space in order to meet some of that Div 296 tax, which of course is still quite prominent in the media circles.
Yeah, 100%. And look, I think this week is the last sitting week of Parliament, so it's one of the things still on the agenda. I have absolutely no idea how far it will progress. There's speculation about an upcoming election that we don't know when. I heard on the news this morning, actually, that it could be the last sitting of Parliament before the next election. It's only speculation. I understand that. But I am of the belief that we won't have another budget before the next election. So take that as you will, anybody who's listening out there, but that's certainly the scuttlebutt that we hear. So, Tracey, I know that you get a lot of questions about buying property and acquiring property in an SMSF. So why don't we look at some of those fundamentals about, if I'm considering buying a property, how do I go about it?
Yeah. So the scariest question that I have been asked time and time again, Darin, is it's Thursday afternoon. I'm going to an auction on Saturday morning, and I'd like to buy this property in my super fund, and I need to borrow for it. What do I need to do? That's the scariest question. Particularly when it comes in at 10 past 5. That's on a Thursday. If it comes at 10 past 5 on a Friday, sorry, no deal. You're out of luck. I'm not going to answer you. But if it comes in on a Thursday, I might, So it's really important to understand the steps involved and the way that you need to structure, the property investment. And I think if you're going to auction, please make sure that you've had a conversation with your advisors beforehand, well before going to auction, because if you need to set up a bare trust, or you need to get some LRBA, some borrowing in place, and you need to know whether you can actually afford to borrow in the super fund, that isn't going to happen within a 24-hour period. You're not going to get that advice necessarily in 24 hours. You might be lucky. And if you do get that advice in 24 hours, you owe your accountant or your advisor big time, because it's a complex piece of advice, So that's a scary question. But, making sure that you've got the name on the contract right. If you're buying this property outright and your trustee name isn't the name that you pop on the contract because you've just popped it in your name, Darin, not the name of your trustee, you might be able to change it. But you might not be able to either. There might become some quite harsh complications or implications if you get something simple like the wrong name on the contract. Because once you've entered into a contract, you've got a legally binding document in front of you. You're bound to that legal document. So just simple things like making sure you understand who the trustee is of your super fund. You understand that if you're going to have borrowing, that it's the trustee of your bare trust that you need to understand, what name goes on the contract, that you need to make sure that you've just got all of your ducks lined up, because you can't necessarily pull out of that contract without some very significant financial implications, and you can't necessarily just change it. You might be able to, like I said, if you've got, happy parties, but you may not be able to as well.
Yeah,
so it's
just
really
on
important
that,
to get that right.
100%, Tracey. And just on that subject, sort of an extension to that subject, does it make a difference where you draw the deposit from? If you have to do a deposit on the spot. So, for example, you're out there, you're thinking, I'm going to get this property for my SMSF. I haven't got the checkbook for the super fund. Oh, can I do it a personal check or personal finance? Like, what difference does that make? I know it's a situation a lot of people do find themselves in.
Yeah, absolutely, Darin. And we're showing our age a little bit talking about checks, aren't we? Because I haven't seen a checkbook.
They're still okay. They're not going to be banned until several years' time.
Exactly. But it does make a difference. And I think, it's really important to understand that if you're buying a property directly, you're not using any borrowings, then you have to pay for the property out of your SMSF bank account.
Yeah.
So you can't just, pull out a checkbook personally and say, well, okay, I'm just going to do this on behalf of the SMSF for this little period in time, because you have either then made a contribution to your super
Yes.
fund with that deposit, or you've actually lent money to your super fund with that deposit. And if you haven't got the paperwork in place, so for example, you haven't set up a bare trust in order to allow for those LRBA borrowing laws, and we'll go through those in another episode, then you could have inadvertently breached the superannuation rules just by paying for the money out of this hand and not this hand, so it's really important to make sure you get that right.
Yeah, I
Don't
know
go
we
to
keep.
auction without it.
No, that's really good advice. But I know we keep banging on about this subject about before you really do anything, you must think it through. You must have your proper strategy in place in order to do it, and more importantly, to execute what you want to do without having any sort of compliance issues that might arise from making a mistake. Because any listeners to many of these episodes will know that we always talk about how completely intertwined a lot of the compliance rules are in
Yeah,
superannuation in general, but in particular self-managed super funds, because you as the trustee will be held ultimately responsible for anything that goes wrong for it. And again, it might be inadvertent, but how easier is it just to get tripped up by one of these things? And then of course, who wants to
yeah,
have to deal with having to rectify that situation? Because everybody would appreciate this, that rectification comes with a lot of pain in terms
yes,
of time and effort, and it would come with a significantly higher amount of cost than if you
yes.
had just executed the transaction in a proper manner in the first.
Correctly. Yeah, exactly right, Darin. And I think that, you may, like I said before, you may be able to rectify these things before it gets too far down the path, but it's always better not to have to do that. It's always better to get all of the things lined up the way that it needs to, understand exactly where you need to write the check from, where the deposit from, where you need to, what documents you need to sign, who you're signing on behalf of, because remember that trustee member, that split personality that you have, so all of that is really important to understand on what capacity am I doing this and how am I going to fund it? Because auctions are probably the worst, I think. And I've even had conversations where clients have said, I'm going to an auction on the weekend. I want to buy, a factory for my business to
Oh.
run out of in the future. Do you think it'll be a good idea to do it in the super fund? And I'm like, man, it's Friday morning, we can't just, you can't just make this stuff happen. You can't make this, all of this magic happen all the time. Sometimes you might be lucky, but that I can't give you a yes all the time if I physically can't do it myself. So, and now we've got more requirements around even the ATO regulating that super fund, and how long does it take for the ATO to, approve that paperwork? There's a lot of steps that we have to go through now that we didn't have to go through maybe 5 or 10 years ago, just because of the, high regulation and the ATO wanting to make sure that there's no illegal access to super and all of the things that we've spoken about
Yeah.
previously.
Yeah. Along with valuations, they're absolutely hot on illegal early access as well. That's another pet
Absolutely.
project of the ATO, and fair enough
Yeah.
too, because it obviously will strengthen the integrity of the sector if they do crack down on bad actors. But
Yeah.
it's like one of those life lessons, Tracey, that our teachers used to tell us at school, that prevention is better than the cure. And
Yes.
definitely in situations like this, prevention is absolutely better than the cure. But
Yeah.
look, liquidity is another important component when you're looking at buying into the asset class of property. So,
Yeah.
what are the key issues that trustees should look towards when they consider liquidity requirements?
Yeah, big liquidity is the biggest one. So when I'm asked these questions about buying property and super, the first is making sure we structure it right in the beginning. So make sure we understand what that looks like. The second part of that is then liquidity. So what if we don't have a tenant for that period of time? If it's residential, what if we have massive repairs that we need to make on the property? What if it's a commercial property and we're using it as our own business premises and we have a struggle within our business? So my thought process and my words to clients that I've spoken with over many years about this is remember that your super fund is not you. So you've got to, as the trustee of that super fund, you have to look after that super fund as if it was you looking after somebody else's property. So what would a standard person, a prudent investor, what would they do in the event of liquidity issues? And I can tell you that most prudent investors that are wanting to look after an asset on behalf of somebody else is not going to say, don't worry about it, mate. You don't have any money. Don't worry about paying the rent. That's fine. You don't have to pay rent this week. It's fine. That doesn't happen, does it? It doesn't happen in the real world. So it's not your money. You know, it is your money, but it's not your money until you can get access to it. So I think one of the biggest risks around liquidity, Darin, is particularly when it's business premises, that we still have to make the rent payments. We still have to keep paying that money to the super fund. And so the super fund needs to take into consideration some of the risk management of what needs to take place. If our tenant, who is ourselves, can't pay the rent, then what does that look like? So we've got to make sure liquidity, that we're not, we're not going to use up all of our money on one property. That's probably not a prudent decision to make. So how do we fix that? How do we look at that? Do we need to make more contributions? Do we need to borrow some money rather than buy outright so that we're not using up all of our cash flow on one particular asset? How can we mitigate the circumstances so that we have more of a diversification across the board? Things like that in terms of liquidity. And, we don't want to get to a stage, and I have seen this, particularly in COVID, and thankfully we did have our COVID measures to be able to do rent relief, but we don't want to get to a stage, Darin, where we can't pay the rent, so therefore the super fund can't afford to hold the asset potentially, and it has to be sold in a potentially depressed market because we're then desperate. So it's all thinking about what ifs. What is the plan B, plan C, plan D, plan E, etc., to make sure that we can still hold this asset long term as we want to. So liquidity is the second most important thing. Structuring it right in the first place is number one, and liquidity to me is number two. And I think that making sure, when you talked about compliance before, Darin, making sure that if you need to rent this property to yourself, if you've got the commercial property, you need to make sure that you have a legally binding lease in place. Yes. And if your lease says the rent is like 3 days late and you have to charge 8% interest, then you have to do that. You can't just ignore it because it's you and you. You have to follow. You have to follow exactly what the requirements are, as if you were renting to a completely, third party that you don't know.
Yeah.
Really
and
important.
Again, with this intertwining of the concepts of superannuation, the most important thing, no matter what you're doing, is the sole purpose test. Right. Yep. And the sole purpose test is that you are building retirement savings to fund your own retirement through your self-managed super fund. It's very hard to argue that you're doing it properly if all of a sudden you're not taking rent from a property that you own or hold within the super fund. I mean, yes, we'd all like to think, I live in Sydney here, and I know that people are a little bit blasé about the property market, thinking that it will forever have an upward trend. And yes, you can always argue that I'm making capital gain out of that asset, which is building on my retirement savings. But income is a massive component of that. And especially when you have to support other aspects of the fund. Say, for example, if you had to support minimum pension payments, how are you going to do that if you're not drawing income, a regular income from some of your investments? And namely, how are you going to do that if you're not getting it from property? Your capital gain isn't going to help you there. So it is really important to consider that. And of course, again, there's nothing to stop the ATO from having a look at that and saying that, well, hang on a minute, if you're not actually collecting rent, how does that go into the sole purpose test? And then they're going to start asking probably questions about, so what was the real reason that you bought this property? And if it's not for superannuation purposes, then that could be an issue as well.
Yeah, that would be an interesting conversation to have with the ATO, you know. So, and I think, Darin, that we the other thing that concerns me when people are talking about property is where they've kind of listened to some hyped up sort of seminar or some sort of sales pitch, if you like. And I'll tread lightly with this as well because we don't want any
Yeah.
hate mail. But
No.
I think that it's really important that people do actually understand and have the strategy behind why they want property in their super funds in the first place. So it's not just a whim decision. It's got to be something that's really well thought out. And I've had many clients who have been very, very successful with lots of property in their super funds, and they've done very well out of property, both commercial and residential. And it was because they had a very well thought out strategy themselves that this is what they wanted to do and this is the type of property they wanted to buy. They didn't just kind of, walk past some auction on a Saturday morning and, whack some money into property that way. It wasn't about that. So, and I've also had clients that, have lost money on property inside their super funds, just like they
Well,
have
yeah.
outside. So it's not always an upward spiral. So, it's about property is a great investment. I have no problems with property at all. Inside the SMSF, there are some more complications. For example, you can't live in a property that your super fund owns. You can't treat that as your retirement. You can't, whilst the super fund owns that property, it is a super fund asset, and you can't just live in that property. You would have to buy the property off the super fund. So, again, not necessarily a bad strategy, not necessarily a bad thing to have to do, but you have to make sure you're following all of the rules.
100%, and you have to make sure that you communicate why you bought that property properly.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
exactly.
again, the ATO might be asking you some serious questions about that. Just as a last thing, Tracey, and we talk about this a lot again, and it is one of the fundamental things that you should consider in a lot of things you do with superannuation. But what about the exit strategy? We talked about what happens when you want to make the original purchase, but how important is the exit strategy, and what needs consideration around that?
Yeah. So to me, that's the third most important thing, right? So how do we get in? How do we structure it? What's the liquidity? How do we get out? And, it's hard to think about that, Darin, when you set up a super fund and you buy a property and you're thinking, 20 years down the track. 20 years down the track is a long time to think, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know about this property in 20 years. Maybe it'll go gangbusters and maybe it won't. I don't know. So it's not about necessarily planning for the exact exit strategy of that particular property. But if, for example, you had bought an asset that was, didn't have very good capital growth prospects, but was doing okay with rental income, then that might be a property that you want to hold forever, but it doesn't have a lot of capital growth. On the other hand, you might be wanting to land bank, and certainly I've had some clients that have land banked inside of super over all of those years. And that's all good and well. But what happens at the time when you want to exit if we need to exit a little bit earlier than perhaps the market's ready for? So it's about having that balance. I think having an exit plan is really important because at the end of the day, we're going to want to turn on that account-based pension at some point in time, and we need to have enough income to sustain that. Otherwise, we get to the point of having to sell assets in order to be able to meet our minimum pension payments or tax liabilities or whatever those liabilities are of the SMSF. Yeah. So the last thing we want to see is that we have to sell an asset at a point in time when perhaps the market isn't going to support that sale at the value that we want for that particular asset, and we're forced to sell it a bit easy. So exit planning is not necessarily per property, but as I've said many, many times, you can't just sell off the front door or the bathroom. It's not like you can sell a portion of it. You've got to sell the whole thing. So if your exit plan is that you have to sell the whole thing, then it's about timing that. So when do we actually want to sell? Well, we really want to sell when we're in pension phase because we reduce the amount of capital gains tax that we have on the sale down to potentially nil. So, can we get the timing right? What does that look like? So always I've said, regardless of whether it's inside a super or outside a super, Darin, we're not just buying a particular asset because we like that particular asset. It's got to fit within the overall plan. It's got to fit within the the liquidity requirements, the rental return, the capital growth, and how do we fund our exit out of that particular thing? Because it's like we don't do anything just for tax reasons. We don't necessarily do anything just because we like a house down the road. It's got to fit within the overall thing, and it's not emotional, and that's, I think, the crucial part. It's not an emotional decision, which is why I don't think it's a good idea to decide to buy property at an auction on a Saturday morning just because you think it might be a fun thing to do.
Very, very true. Well, Tracy, I think we've covered off the fundamentals pretty well, and it's a nice round off for this episode because, as usual, we've run out of time. But I'd like to thank you always, Trace, for joining me today in presenting this episode of the Trusted Trustee podcast. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Darin, and I look forward to talking about business real property and transferring properties into super in the next episode. Be fun.
I can't wait for that. Just a quick shout out to my team for helping us put these podcasts together. Thank you very much for Alex and Vicky, who work tirelessly in the background to do this. But most importantly, thank you very much to you for joining us today, viewing either or listening, doesn't really matter. We really enjoy having you with us, and we hope you're enjoying these series of podcasts as much as we're enjoying presenting them for you. And again, don't forget, if you are enjoying any of our content on YouTube, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Other than that, thanks for tuning in to the Trusted Trustee podcast, and we look forward to having you with us for the next episode. Bye for now.
Bye.